When President Donald Trump met Pope Leo XIV for the first time, the world expected a diplomatic handshake, a few carefully chosen words, and a photo op for history books. But what actually happened behind closed doors left the Vatican stunned, the media scrambling for answers, and Trump visibly shaken. What could have caused the Pope to publicly reject the president's hand? And what did he say afterward that sent shockwaves across both political and religious worlds? This is the story they didn't want you to hear. In the months leading up to the historic meeting between President Donald Trump and Pope Leo XIV, tensions were already simmering beneath the polished surface of international diplomacy. The announcement of the meeting had taken many by surprise. Pope Leo XIV, elected just a year prior, was seen by many as a reformer, intellectual, spiritual, and deeply principled. Unlike his predecessors, he did not shy away from confronting powerful figures when he felt moral lines were being crossed. He was known within the Vatican as the silent flame, gentle in demeanour, but capable of burning through deception with a single, quiet phrase. On the other side of the world, President Trump had built a reputation as a showman, a leader who governed with flair, tweets, and unshakable self-confidence. His administration had clashed with numerous world leaders, including long-standing allies, and his attitude toward institutions of global cooperation was often one of skepticism, if not outright hostility. Despite this, Trump had made efforts to appear presidential on the world stage, particularly when religion and tradition were involved. He knew the optics of standing beside the Pope were powerful, and perhaps, in his mind, redemptive. Inside the Vatican, however, there were concerns. Senior advisors whispered that this visit might not go according to protocol. Pope Leo XIV had grown increasingly troubled by the political climate erupting in the West, especially the rise of what he called moral spectacle, leaders using religion not as a guidepost, but as a prop. He had already declined several invitations to meet high-ranking political figures he believed were acting in bad faith. So when Trump's request for an audience came through diplomatic channels, there was hesitation, not from fear, but from conscience. The Pope reportedly spent days in private reflection. He reviewed Trump's speeches, his policy decisions, and even watched recordings of his rallies. But what troubled him most were not the politics. They were the intentions behind them. A man who governs with mirrors, he allegedly told his close inner circle, does not seek truth. He seeks only reflection. Nevertheless, the Pope agreed to meet. Some speculated it was out of duty. Others believed he wanted to confront Trump in a way only a spiritual leader could, quietly, without grandstanding, but with purpose. Preparations began. Vatican staff were instructed not to overplan the ceremonial details. No red carpet, no extra press, just a simple, formal encounter. This was not to be a performance. Meanwhile, the American delegation treated it like a media opportunity. Teams from the State Department, security personnel, image consultants, and a small group of trusted advisors flew ahead to coordinate logistics. Trump himself, according to leaked notes, wanted the moment to be something iconic. He reportedly practiced gestures in front of aides, how to shake the Pope's hand with strength but not dominance, what angle he should stand at for photos, even how long to hold the handshake to make a statement. But even then, the signs of unease began to appear. The Vatican was strangely unaccommodating. There were fewer photo ops than expected. Trump's team requested a joint press conference. Denied. They asked if Trump could walk beside the Pope, through St. Peter's Square, denied. "This will be a meeting, not a performance," said a Vatican spokesperson, carefully chosen words that hinted at what was to come. On the morning of the meeting, the contrast between the two men became immediately apparent. Trump arrived in a motorcade of black SUVs, flanked by Secret Service agents and staffers buzzing in earpieces. As he stepped out, cameras clicked furiously. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his coat, and smiled as he approached the Vatican gates. Inside, Pope Leo XIV was already waiting, not at the grand entrance, but at a side hallway just past the Apostolic Palace. He wore simple white robes, as always, and carried with him only a small leather-bound notebook. As the president was escorted into the hall, there was an air of expectation. Advisors and diplomats from both sides lined the corridor. The moment of greeting was seconds away. Trump stepped forward confidently, hand outstretched, eyes locked on the Pope. In that instant, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Photographers raised their cameras. The Vatican delegation stood still. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. As President Trump extended his hand, the room fell into a thick and weighty silence. It was a moment that had been rehearsed, anticipated, and framed by countless expectations, a symbolic gesture of peace, diplomacy, and mutual respect between two of the world's most powerful men. But instead of returning the handshake, Pope Leo XIV stood motionless. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. His hands, folded gently at his waist, did not move. He simply looked at the president with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of silence and truth. At first, Trump thought it was a delay. Perhaps the Pope hadn't noticed the gesture. He held his hand out a second longer, his smile faltering just slightly. But when the Pope offered only a slow, solemn nod, never breaking eye contact, the message became clear. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. A barely audible gasp echoed from someone at the back of the room. A camera shutter clicked once, then paused. The Swiss guard, always statuesque, seemed to stand even more still than usual. Cardinal Antonelli, the Pope's Secretary of State, shifted uncomfortably. On the American side, there was a flurry of awkward glances. One aide, tasked with live streaming the moment to social media, instinctively lowered their phone. They weren't sure if this was still part of the plan. Trump quickly lowered his hand, his smile tightening into something less genuine, more strained, more calculating. The silence stretched for a few seconds longer, yet in that vacuum of sound, the world seemed to roar. Everyone present knew they had just witnessed something that would be endlessly dissected, debated, and analysed. A diplomatic snub, a holy protest, a power move. Without saying a word, Pope Leo turned slightly and gestured toward a nearby door, indicating that they should proceed to the private chambers where the formal discussion would take place. His gesture was gentle, respectful even, but it carried an undeniable weight. He had just made it clear that he would not participate in the theatre of politics, not even for the sake of tradition or politeness. Trump followed, his step slightly slower. The confident bounce in his stride diminished. Though he tried to keep his composure, his body language betrayed a degree of confusion, maybe even anger. For a man who had built his identity on dominance, gestures, and symbolism, the refusal of a handshake from the most revered religious figure in the world was more than just an insult. It was a defiance he wasn't used to encountering. The Vatican staff had been trained to handle moments of tension, but even they weren't prepared for this. A few looked away. Others pretended not to notice. But deep inside the corridors of power, they knew this moment would reverberate far beyond the walls of the Apostolic Palace. Back in Washington, Trump's team scrambled to control the narrative. Some claimed the Pope had arthritis. Others said it was a cultural misunderstanding. Still others insisted there had been a handshake, but the camera angle simply missed it. The Vatican made no comment, but among journalists, theologians, and political analysts, a different interpretation began to take shape. They looked to the Pope's past sermons, his subtle criticisms of populist politics, and his belief that faith should never be co-opted by spectacle. They remembered his homily just weeks earlier, when he said, "The devil rarely shouts. He whispers through applause. He dresses in gold and demands to be touched." Was the Pope delivering a quiet rebuke, not just to Trump the man, but to what he represented? A world driven by ego, pageantry, and profit, where leaders chase applause instead of virtue. Across social media, the moment went viral. The clip of the non-handshake, less than 10 seconds long, was played on repeat with dramatic music, exaggerated captions, and endless commentary. Some hailed the Pope as a spiritual hero. Others called it a diplomatic blunder, but no one could deny its impact. It had pierced through the noise of politics in a way no press conference ever could. In the days that followed, conspiracy theories sprouted. Was this a planned message to global elites? A secret sign to the faithful? Or simply an expression of a man who refused to bow to anything less than truth? Inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV remained silent. When asked by his aides if he would like to clarify what happened, he reportedly responded with only 5 words: "The world will interpret itself." Meanwhile, Trump's behaviour noticeably changed. Though outwardly defiant, claiming the meeting had gone perfectly, beautifully, he was unusually restrained in his post-meeting remarks. He did not mention the Pope by name, he did not tweet a photo of the moment. And those who travelled with him on Air Force One said he spent the flight back staring out the window, uncharacteristically quiet. What Pope Leo had done was more than deny a handshake. He had withheld validation. He had turned a simple moment into a mirror. And in that mirror, the world saw something uncomfortable, something real. The heavy wooden doors to the Pope's private chamber closed with a soft but resonant thud, sealing off the outside world. The marble hallway, once alive with the clamour of staff and journalists, fell into silence. Inside the chamber, however, something entirely different was beginning. A conversation that, while unrecorded, would echo louder than most public speeches. The room was understated, yet reverent. A crucifix hung on the far wall, lit only by a sliver of natural light that filtered through high-arched windows. There were no microphones, no media, no aides. Just 2 chairs, 1 small table, and 2 of the most powerful men on earth. Pope Leo XIV moved with the grace of someone who carried centuries of tradition on his shoulders, yet bore it lightly. He motioned for Trump to sit, then took his own seat across from him. The atmosphere was not confrontational, it was contemplative, almost sacred, yet the air buzzed with tension. For the first few seconds, neither man spoke. Trump, usually the first to feel silence, seemed thrown off by the Pope's stillness. The Pope's eyes, steady and piercing, did not avert. He studied Trump, not with contempt, but with a kind of sorrowful curiosity. It was as if he were trying to see past the office, the image, even the man, and into the soul that resided within. Then, softly, the Pope spoke. "Tell me, Mr. President, when you stand in front of a mirror, what do you see?" It wasn't a political question. It wasn't even rhetorical. It was personal, intimate, almost disarming. Trump blinked, taken aback. He opened his mouth to speak, hesitated, then offered a smile. "I see someone who's worked very hard, someone who's fought to be where he is, a winner." The Pope didn't nod, nor did he frown. He simply waited. "And I think," Trump added, "a lot of people see that too. The strength, the success." Pope Leo leaned slightly forward. "Strength," he said quietly, "is not in the noise we make. It is in the silence we endure. And success is not measured by what you build for yourself, but what remains when you are gone." Trump shifted in his chair. His usual confidence began to show cracks, not because he had been attacked, but because the conversation was moving into territory he couldn't control. There was no audience here to win over, no crowd to applaud him. "I didn't come here for a sermon," he said, though his voice lacked the edge of confrontation. "I came to talk about partnership, cooperation." The Pope nodded. "Yes, cooperation. But not all alliances are holy, Mr. President. Some are forged in fear, others in vanity. The ones that endure, they are forged in truth." There was a long pause. Outside, a single church bell rang in the distance. Then the Pope continued, his voice steady. "I have studied your country closely. I have seen its hunger, not just for wealth or safety, but for meaning. Your people are not starving for food, they are starving for something deeper. And what do you give them?" Trump's eyes narrowed slightly. "Hope, jobs, strength. They elected me because I don't sugarcoat things. I tell it like it is." The Pope lowered his gaze briefly, then looked back up. His words came slowly now, with the gravity of someone who had spoken to kings and peasants alike. "You give them mirrors," he said, "not windows." Trump leaned back, unsure how to respond. "You hold up a mirror," the Pope continued, "and you show them themselves, not as they are, but as they wish to be. You let them see their anger, and you tell them it is pride. You let them see their fear, and you call it courage. You do not offer direction. You offer reflection. And the people are seduced by their own image." There was no malice in his tone, only deep, genuine concern. "And yet," the Pope added gently, "there is still time." Trump looked away. For the first time in the meeting, his face showed not defiance, but thoughtfulness, a crack in the armour. The Pope stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the Vatican gardens, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. "You carry great responsibility, Mr. President, but do not mistake attention for reverence. The world is watching, yes, but what it needs, what it cries out for, is not a leader who feeds its reflection, but one who reveals its soul." Trump stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your perspective," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, "even if I don't agree with all of it." The Pope turned back to him and gave a faint smile. "You don't need to agree. You need only to listen." He then reached for his small notebook on the table and handed Trump a page torn from it. On it, in handwritten Latin, was a quote from St. Augustine: "Melius est tardius ambulare in via quam citius extra viam." It is better to walk slowly on the path than to walk fast off of it. Trump folded the paper, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and gave the Pope a single nod. There was no handshake, no final flourish, just a parting glance, and then the quiet return to the outer world. One man changed, the other simply continuing his path. What exactly had been said behind those doors would never be fully revealed, but something had shifted, and the ripple of that meeting would stretch far beyond the Vatican walls. 2 days passed before the Vatican made its move. During that time, speculation had reached a fever pitch. Journalists, analysts, and theologians pored over every frame of footage, every whisper from unnamed sources, every diplomatic detail. Why had the Pope refused the handshake? What was said in private? And perhaps more importantly, was there a message meant for the world buried beneath that awkward silence? The Vatican, known for its centuries-old mastery of discretion and symbolism, said nothing at first. The press office released a short, templated note confirming the meeting between Pope Leo XIV and President Trump had taken place in a private and respectful setting. No elaboration, no photos, no quotes. It was an intentional vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed the storm of public imagination. Speculative headlines dominated global media. The Pope's silent protest. What was Trump told behind closed doors? Faith meets force, the clash at the Vatican. On social media, the handshake refusal became a meme. Artists reimagined the scene as a Renaissance painting. Satirists dubbed it "the day the Pope ghosted the president." But beneath the jokes was a growing sense that something meaningful had occurred, something larger than ego, politics, or protocol. Then, just as the world was beginning to accept the silence, the Vatican broke it. Early in the morning on the second day, the Holy See issued a statement. Not a press release, not a tweet, but a printed communiqué, released through its centuries-old internal bulletin, L'Osservatore Romano, and then published online in Latin and translated into several major languages. The message was brief. No names were mentioned, no direct references to Trump, America, or the meeting itself. But the words, poetic, razor-sharp, and unmistakably deliberate, pierced through the global noise like thunder through a cathedral. It read, "Faith does not kneel before empires, nor do holy hands reach toward vanity. The shepherd must walk with his flock, not bow before its idols. Where silence replaces applause, truth begins to speak." The weight of the message was immediate and overwhelming. To many within the Church, this was a modern encyclical in miniature, a coded warning to the faithful not to confuse earthly power with divine purpose. To political observers, it was a rare rebuke, carefully crafted to be irrefutable, yet clearly aimed at a specific figure. Within hours, theologians began publishing analyses. Was the phrase, "holy hands reach toward vanity," a reference to the handshake that never was? Was Marsden's a subtle nod to American exceptionalism or to the cult of personality surrounding modern political leaders? And what of the line where silence replaces applause? That seemed to be an explicit rejection of political theatre, of showmanship devoid of substance. The Vatican offered no clarification. Meanwhile, inside the White House, the statement hit like a diplomatic grenade. Trump's team was furious. Senior aides debated how to respond. Some pushed for a counterstatement, others wanted to ignore it. Eventually, a decision was made to spin the event as a misunderstanding, to downplay the Pope's words as generic spiritual advice. The President respects the Pope deeply, one spokesperson told reporters. They had a productive meeting, and any interpretation beyond that is unnecessary. But the damage was done. World leaders took note. Foreign diplomats, many of whom had grown wary of Trump's unpredictability, now saw a moral authority take a public stand without ever raising his voice. The message wasn't just about Trump. It was about the new age of politics. The age where populism masquerades as principle, where moral ambiguity is sold as strength, where power is measured in applause, not purpose. And yet, the brilliance of the Vatican's approach lay in its ambiguity. The Pope hadn't called out Trump by name. He didn't need to. The world had already drawn its own conclusions. The lack of direct confrontation only made the message more potent, less a punch, more a parable. Inside the Catholic world, the effect was seismic. Many bishops and cardinals, especially those who had been quietly disillusioned by the growing overlap between faith and nationalism, felt emboldened. Pope Leo XIV had reminded them of something ancient yet urgent. The Church was not a stage for kings, nor a tool for the powerful. It was a sanctuary of truth, and truth often stood alone. Meanwhile, the American public responded along predictable lines. Supporters of Trump dismissed the Pope as just another globalist, accusing the Vatican of meddling in politics. Others, however, found themselves unexpectedly moved. The Pope's restraint, his use of parable instead of accusation, had stirred something deeper than any press conference or rally could. Late-night television shows analysed the statement like scripture. One host described it as the most savage spiritual subtweet of all time. Another called it God's mic drop. But far from the noise, inside the quiet halls of the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV remained silent. When asked by his staff if he wanted to issue a follow-up, he declined. When a group of cardinals offered to clarify the Church's position publicly, he reportedly smiled and said only, "The world understands more when I speak less." He understood what so few in power do, that true influence is not about control or volume or even clarity. It is about resonance. And his words had resonated in palaces and parliaments, on smartphones and in sanctuaries. The Vatican had spoken once, and it was enough. From that day forward, any mention of Trump's visit to the Vatican came with a shadow. A moment remembered, not for what was said aloud, but for what was denied, what was withheld, and what was quietly, devastatingly revealed. The aftermath of the meeting between Pope Leo XIV and President Donald Trump unfolded not as a clean resolution, but as a spreading wave of consequences, seen and unseen, personal and political. The Pope's subtle yet thunderous gesture, the refusal of a handshake, and his poetic but piercing statement had already reshaped the global conversation. But the story didn't end there. Within the White House, the mood had shifted dramatically. What was meant to be a triumphant photo op with the leader of the Catholic world had turned into something altogether different. A confrontation with moral authority that had left Trump exposed. His aides attempted to put on a brave face. Official statements were issued describing the meeting as productive, emphasizing cooperation on religious freedom and international peace. But behind the scenes, Trump was reportedly furious. He had been publicly slighted in a way he could neither spin nor ignore. And worse, the slight hadn't come from a rival politician or a partisan critic. It had come from a man who didn't even raise his voice. In private conversations, Trump referred to the Pope as sanctimonious and passive-aggressive, suggesting that Leo XIV had staged the moment to embarrass him. He thinks he's above politics, Trump reportedly said. Well, he just played a political game better than anybody else. The statement revealed a deeper frustration, an understanding perhaps that what had transpired in that quiet Vatican chamber had cut deeper than any campaign trail jab. In the following weeks, Trump saw opportunities to reassert his dominance. At rallies, he amped up his bravado, using the language of strength and success. Though he never mentioned the Pope directly, some of his comments were widely interpreted as veiled references. America doesn't bow to anyone in robes. We don't need ancient institutions telling us what's moral. We know what's right for us. The crowd cheered, but those who were paying closer attention noticed a crack in the armour. The remarks were defensive, not commanding. International leaders were watching closely. Some, especially in Europe, were quietly emboldened by the Pope's stance. Others used it as a signal that the political climate was shifting toward a world where moral credibility could challenge material power. In diplomatic circles, the Vatican's quiet rebuke became a case study. How a single gesture, performed without words, could change the tone of global discourse. The American public, predictably, was divided. Among Trump's loyal base, the Pope's actions were seen as disrespectful and ungrateful. Social media was ablaze with accusations of religious elitism and globalist interference. Conservative commentators accused the Pope of abandoning Christian values in favour of political posturing. Calls even emerged for churches to reconsider their allegiance to Rome. But among moderates and spiritual thinkers, the reaction was very different. The Pope's restraint, his refusal to engage in spectacle, was seen as a radical form of integrity. Editorials praised him for not stooping to political theatre. Religious scholars noted that Leo XIV was following the tradition of Christ himself, rebuking the powerful not with violence, but with silence, parable, and presence. Within days, the Pope's words, "Faith does not kneel before empires, nor do holy hands reach toward vanity," were being quoted in sermons, classrooms, and op-eds. The phrase began appearing on banners during peaceful protests, on digital billboards, even graffitied onto city walls. For many, it became more than a political statement. It was a reminder of what moral leadership could look like in an age of manipulation and noise. Even within Trump's own circle, the impact lingered. Advisors began whispering that the meeting hadn't gone the way it was supposed to. One senior official, speaking anonymously, said he was expecting a coronation. What he got was a confession, one he didn't even know he was giving. Meanwhile, the Pope said nothing further. no clarifications, no interviews. When asked in a later Vatican briefing whether he would meet President Trump again, the reply was simple. His Holiness meets with all who seek peace. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was, in the style of Leo XIV, a statement meant to be felt more than passed. Months later, when Pope Leo XIV addressed the United Nations General Assembly via video, his speech was quietly anticipated by millions. There were no theatrics, no political jabs, just a steady, uncompromising call to conscience. "We must remember," he said, "that power which does not serve truth will eventually devour itself. And those who seek to lead must learn first how to kneel, not before idols or applause, but before the pain of the people they claim to serve." The applause was long and sincere. Trump never spoke of the Pope again in public. The video of the non-handshake remained online, circulating as a moment of rare clarity in a confusing age. Over time, some saw it as the beginning of a moral reckoning, others as a missed opportunity, but few denied its weight. It was a lesson in the power of quiet conviction, how one man, dressed in white, armed with nothing but stillness and a sentence, could shake the foundations of the loudest empire on earth. And though the world moved on, that moment in the Vatican, when power reached out its hand and holiness refused to touch it, remained, like all things sacred, etched in memory long after it had passed.